Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be here. As was mentioned, my name is Erika Dyck, and I come to you from Treaty 6 territory, or the homeland of the Métis in Canada, or Saskatchewan, the place where the word psychedelic was first coined. I've been working on the history of psychedelics for over 20 years now, and I'm really excited to be here. This is my first time, actually this is my second time in Turku, my first time at this organization, and I'm really excited to start to think a little bit more about the global dimensions of the history of psychedelics, but also to really sort of anchor our thinking in some of these historical trends and themes that I think are starting to, or perhaps should even more, help us to understand what the psychedelic renaissance is all about. And so I wanted to sort of set the tone here a little bit by, placing out these kinds of, to me, somewhat iconic images of psychedelics moving into a kind of laboratory biomedical context, and of course there are precedents for that, but also this kind of hearkening back to the cultural roots, some of which might be countercultural. This image of the Huicholi man comes from the San Francisco Oracle, was painted by Rick Griffin. Some of you may have seen this kind of artwork before. It has become some of the classic, iconic countercultural imagery, but also maybe suggests that there's an Indigenous connection here as well. And I'm not sure what to make of this man, whether he's happy or sad, but if we had the whole picture, he's surrounded by psychedelic plants. So when I started my research in the early 2000s, I focused a lot on a fellow named Humphrey Osmond, who was a psychiatrist who was British trained and moved to Canada in 1951. In 1956, he was writing letters with Aldous Huxley, and I don't mean to belabor all of these words, but I thought this would be fun to show you. We found the original text where he writes psychedelic for the first time. And in the blue penmanship there, you can see Aldous Huxley writing. He says, "To make this trivial world sublime, take 1/2 gram of phanerothym." And as we are all sitting here at a psychedelic conference, phanerothym did not stick. Humphrey Osmond wrote in red below, "To plumb the depths or soar angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic." And many of you may have seen this phrasing. It's changed over the years. He even changed it the next time when he typed it up to say to fall in hell or soar angelic. And you'll see this sort of repeated in a variety of different ways. So I wanted to sort of pause on this idea of the word psychedelic, which is still being used today, and to question whether or not that is the appropriate term that we want to carry forward into the 21st century, what it means and where it came from. And I'm going to make a plug here and suggest that we should continue to use it, but I'll explain why in a moment. Both of them wanted to use words that were unshackled from a particular kind of orthodoxy or even disciplinary language. Huxley, of course, was a philosopher connected to a long family history of biologists, evolutionary biologists, and he was concerned that science and society needed to really mix. We needed culture and science in order to really sort of breathe life into this moment where, oops, can I say I've got it? No, that's all right. And Osmond responded with this idea of delos, or from the Greek derivation to bring to light. And so I wanted to sort of play with these ideas a little bit here and be a nerd and show you historical documents. The first publication of the word psychedelic was in 1957 in this article, which has now been cited 176 times, it says, although it probably ought to be more. And in this article, they go on about what psychedelics mean. Initially, Osmond, of course, suggested that it was psychomimetic, that is, madness mimicking, and that it could be used as a tool by not just psychiatrists and psychologists, but social workers, nurses, perhaps even a few politicians who might have greater empathy for studying psychiatry and psychosis in particular by taking these kinds of substances, and what they were talking about was LSD, mescaline, and later they brought psilocybin into their research trials. But I'm going to suggest that psychedelic actually comes out of its own kind of Renaissance moment that draws on a deeper, richer history that goes beyond this kind of biomedical container or biomedical understanding of how we might apply psychedelics. And that even people like Osmond and Huxley were drawing on this richer tradition. A tradition of sacred plants, things that would later be called entheogens, or those in encouraging us to think about the spiritual dimensions. We also have the word hallucinogen, which is also coined ultimately in the 1950s, but draws from a Latin word to hallucinate or to wander in the mind. And of course, there are a number of people already up by the 1950s when the word psychedelic is introduced. There are also a number of people who are looking at the anthropological, cultural, and even parapsychological dimensions of what consciousness studies might gain from an investment in psychedelics. As part of a project that I was working on with a bunch of other folks, we were trying to understand the global dimensions of this concept of psychedelics. So if we look at just the published literature, so looking through what's available online, this is not the result of archival research, but this is what the internet will tell you about the spread of psychedelics. It is very limited, in my opinion, because it does not include a lot of work that is not on the internet, and it is also limited in some respects by linguistic derivations. But nonetheless, I think that these maps hopefully suggest to you that despite those shortcomings, there is an amazing story to be told here of the movement of psychedelics or the movement of psychedelic substances around the world over time, long before the 1950s. And that, to me as a historian, this is very exciting because it suggests that there should be a whole host of other stories, other kinds of evidence that we might now use to think about the different traditions and themes that are being reinvigorated today. So for me as a historian, this makes me think about what the Renaissance is actually trying to resurrect. What are we trying to reclaim in this so-called Renaissance moment, if we agree that there's a Renaissance, but I'll leave that aside for a moment and just say there is. And I wonder then which pieces of that psychedelic history we want to privilege as we move forward. And these are just a few different images that I've selected from different projects that I've been working on to suggest that there are plant-based stories. There is also anti-drug literature, and there's actually representation. These are just a few examples, but there's representations from all around the world of how psychedelics have sort of bedded down into either medical cultures or other even countercultures, musical cultures, and you can pick your favorite one if you like. I won't go on about all of these specific images, but if there are questions, feel free to come back. So when I started my research in the early 2000s, I focused on the medical aspect of psychedelic history. I was interested in conducted in what we might consider a kind of clinical trial. Most of these were case studies at the time, not clinical trials like randomized controlled ones, but it was in the context of a psychopharmacological revolution. It was in a moment when psychiatrists and psychologists and increasingly neuroscientists were questioning the modern world. We're questioning all sorts of kinds of suffering, categorizing suffering, and trying to understand how we can ameliorate these symptoms. And cynically, we're also looking at how we can reduce funding for psychiatric disorders, that is, large-scale hospitals. So when Albert Hofmann introduced LSD in the 1940s, but notably in the 1950s as that research was picked up, some people suggest that LSD was not that remarkable. It joined a wave of chemical interest that introduced all sorts of other psychopharmacological substances. I have to choose my word before I say it. So people like Stan Grof, who's still talking about psychedelics and holotropic breathwork today, suggested that this generated a powerful wave of interest in brain chemistry. Together with the development of tranquilizers like chlorpromazine, it was directly responsible for what has been called the golden age of psychopharmacology. So psychedelics sort of rode this wave of interest in looking at pharmacology as a way to manage human suffering on a massive scale, on one that was unprecedented in human history. And if I'm looking through especially American and Canadian medical literature at the time, but of course this is not concentrated only in North America, there's just a massive wave of advertisements that are associated with this time frame as well. The direct-to-consumer advertising as well as direct-to-clinical advertising, clinician advertising about the power of psychopharmacology to change the way that we manage human suffering. This coincides, of course, with the American Psychiatric Association's introduction of their classic manual, the DSM, that now is, I think, in its 5th edition. Now, of course, there were critics. Even at the time, there were critics that this is actually paving the way to a good pharmaceutical industry or big pharma, and that this is not, in fact, ameliorating human suffering. And I think I would probably agree with David Healy, that psychopharmacologist David Healy, that this has been good for business and maybe hasn't been as good for science. But I want to suggest that psychedelic researchers, even in the 1950s, also generated their own share of critics. Critics who were curious about psychedelics, but who deeply questioned the place of psychopharmacology as a way of managing human suffering. And here are a few examples. You can pick your favorite. I like Foucault, who's, sitting there in California on an LSD trip, allegedly, and you can read one of many books now on this topic. But other people who are maybe lesser known, like Eileen Garrett, pictured here holding Tomorrow magazine, something that she co-founded. Eileen Garrett was a parapsychologist who suggested that we needed to think about consciousness studies, bringing psychedelics and parapsychology together. And she was not, this is not as marginal as one might think. Here she is with Albert Hofmann. It's not the greatest picture, but it is a snapshot taken by Humphrey Osmond when they met together in Eileen Garrett's home in France. And this idea that you needed to draw from other kinds of influences, even marginal influences, even those well outside the kind of mainstream of biomedical sciences. And I show the Mad Pride symbol here as well to suggest that patients' rights, ex-patients' rights, and madness advocates are also part of the story of psychedelics. People like Humphrey Osmond, I think, were attuned to this idea that you needed to draw from these various influences, these diverse influences, that we couldn't put all of our eggs in one basket, so to speak, that we shouldn't put psychedelics all into perhaps a biomedical frame, he might say today. And you can read this in Doors of Perception, where he talked a little bit more about this. I find this interesting, and I'm a historian, so I'm going to bore you with trivia because I have the microphone. He wrote that book in about 26 days after his first mescaline trip, over the course of 26 days. He had a first draft within a week, so he was clearly taken by his mescaline experience. And again, not the greatest picture, but a historically authentic picture of Aldous Huxley looking out over Beverly Hills with his mescalinized eyes, as Humphrey Osmond wrote. It's a snapshot that Osmond took of him. There are, of course, other ways that psychedelics have attracted critics, we might say, or other forms of cultural expression. And I think the countercultural piece of this is one that is a little bit awkward right now in our moment, in our psychedelic renaissance moment, that is. I think the countercultural expressions and this curiosity about psychedelics, even maybe we might argue the fun part of psychedelics that doesn't always fit into the biomedical model, is something, and by my own anecdotal experience going to psychedelic conferences, sometimes it's the part that we're supposed to not talk about, or the part that we dial down, or the part that we try to avoid this time around. How can we make sure there's not another Timothy Leary, or a Ken Kesey, or choose your own favorite psychedelic bad guy? They're all guys. Just kidding. But actually, I think that this is wrong-headed. And if we look around the world, again, we take that global dimension, there are different ways that psychedelics have bedded down into different kinds of cultural expressions. We see psychedelics in an Israeli psychedelic group here in 1967. We see all sorts of music and poetry and countercultural expressions coming out of Brazil during a dictatorship when they couldn't talk about the same kind of counterculture reactions as the Americans could, but where youthful activists were very much aligned with these psychedelic themes. And of course, there's the hippie trail going through the Middle East and many American examples as well. Oh yeah, and then the Rolling Stones, those guys. And I think there's a clash that takes place here between the kind of rising up of countercultural expressions about psychedelics that sometimes get blamed for taking psychedelics off the kind of mainstream rails. But there's another story here that I think we need to bear in mind. That is the ways in which science itself became a critic of psychopharmacology and chemicals more broadly, and the concerns raised by our inability to collectively decide on how to manage the risks associated with embracing chemicals in our environments, in our bodies, and at which times. Here are a few examples. In the wake of controversies like those inspired by the thalidomide crisis or the teratogenic birth defects associated with pregnant women taking pharmaceuticals, in this case thalidomide, or the wake of the Green Revolution, where agricultural scientists were concerned that we are poisoning the earth rather than amplifying our capacity to produce good agriculture, the rise of double-blind clinical trials or randomized controlled trials start to take hold within the clinical domains and start to squeeze out some of the psychedelic research. Not initially, but I think over time, psychedelic researchers were sort of moved to the edges, and in part, for reasons that we probably all here know, because of the set and setting, I think that works in combination with the pharmacology. So psychedelics, of course, didn't operate simply on a pharmacological or transactional basis, but required a relationship with the set and setting. Researchers during the late 1950s, early 1960s began to recognize that subjects coming in for trials already had in mind what they were going to experience. They wanted to bring their own record sets. They weren't content to listen to the playlists provided by psychedelic researchers. And they were using clinical trials, we might say, as a safe place to take LSD, mescaline, psilocybin, and later other substances. This was also challenging scientific research at the time. How do you measure experience, as you just described a few moments ago? How do we actually measure experience when people come with preset ideas? But by the early 1970s, many of those scientific questions lay dormant because international policies, we might look to Richard Nixon, we can blame him for declaring a war on drugs, but the United Nations also had a convention in 1971 that made LSD and other psychedelic substances placed on Schedule 1, so not considered valuable for medical use. But of course, here we are today, not just a few of us, but I hear there's more people online as well. And all over the world, there are these sort of bubbling up of a resurgence of interest in psychedelics. So I wonder, what is it about this history that we want to bring forward? What parts do we want to resurrect? And do we want to go the way of psychedelic science? I don't know if anybody here was in Denver. It was kind of a zoo. Yeah, it was a bit of a zoo, right? Yeah, it was crazy. 13,000 people there. I mean, I don't even know. It was impossible to even sort of take it in. But I think there was a very, in my opinion at least, there was a sense that we are on the cusp of something great, that this is going to change regulation, this is going to demonstrate to the world perhaps, that psychedelics deserve another chance in science, as the title suggests. But by way of conclusion, I want to suggest that by only looking at the scientific context, I think we are missing a rich part of this history. We think about integrating psychedelics in a more sustainable way, but may also serve as a cautionary tale in a more sophisticated and nuanced way where we can think a little bit more, perhaps more deeply, about whose stories are left in, whose stories get brought in, rather, and whose are left out. How should we reconcile, perhaps, and balance the needs of access to psychedelics, whether in clinical therapy, or to rethink the ideas of human suffering along the lines of, say, indigenous shamanic uses in ways that balance concerns for the environment, as are depicted in a lot of indigenous renderings. The middle two here are both from indigenous, or suggesting indigenous drawings. And how do we begin to balance these kinds of social justice and equity needs in a more sustainable way? My suggestion, humbly, is that I think we need to look beyond the well-trod stories, look beyond heroes and villains of psychedelic past, but to embrace a more diverse context for understanding what it is we're trying to build upon before we move the next story forward. And with that, I wanted to thank you and just suggest that Humphrey Osmond isn't such a bad advocate for, suggesting that psychedelic has this capacity, this capacious way of thinking about psychedelics that can draw from diverse influences. These are a few examples of things that he did, but I just wanted to point out, some of the indigenous ceremonies that he sat in, the parapsychology woman who became the godmother to his daughter, the ways that he went to Haight-Ashbury and handed out niacin and met with psychedelic underground makers of LSD, as examples of someone who was sort of open to those ideas, and I think that's the spirit that we should continue to embrace. So, thank you.
So thank you, Erika, for a wonderful presentation. We have now time for a couple of questions.
Hey, thank you for the presentation. Do you have a thought, why isn't mescaline studied more? Like, I know that it's really sacred, but like, let's say it's really, I think, really potential and beneficial possibly. So why isn't mescaline more studied in clinical settings?
That's a great question. So why isn't mescaline more studied? A couple of answers, or a couple of thoughts. Mike Jay's book on mescaline, the original psychedelic, suggests, he sort of suggests that mescaline not only is harder to metabolize, has been a little bit less fun, I suppose, or, it's also less consistent in terms of some of the results. I think that's a fair point. I don't know how many people were at the ICPR conference in Haarlem last year about this time. There were a couple of psychopharmacologists who were also faced with that question, and I'm not a psychopharmacologist, but if I can ventriloquize them for a moment, they also suggested that the supplies were less stable, that they were getting less consistent results, that some of the other psychedelics were easier to work with, not in a regulatory sense, but in a pharmacological sense, which I'm convinced perhaps by that, I don't know. And I'll maybe just mention, I recently was invited to sit in a peyote ceremony, and it was actually by the people of, I'll just go back here for a second. There's a picture there of a man with it's actually a whistle that he's using in a ceremonial sense, and you can perhaps see Humphrey Osmond sitting beside him there, hunched over, taking a peyote button. The grandchildren of this ceremony invited me to come and sit with them as they honored Humphrey Osmond for helping them to get legal access to peyote. And I sat with them a few months ago, and what they explained to me was that, they want to protect this peyote way. They don't want to use the word mescaline, first of all, because it is not mescaline, and it's an instructive interjection, I think, as we sort of think about these substances as pharmacological substances, and their clear argument was, it's not even about the substance. It's about the fasting before, it's about the song, it's about the prayer, it's about deference to a moment and to an experience, psychopharmacological. Now, that doesn't answer your question about mescaline, but it is a helpful reminder to me of, the substance and the setting.
Hello. Do you know, have there been any studies regarding psychedelics and physiotherapy?
Sorry, psychedelics and?
And psychedelics and physiotherapy.
Psychedelics and physiotherapy. I'll be shocked if there aren't, just because every time I say, no, I don't think so, then I find out that I'm wrong, and things are changing quickly. But, I'm just, as you ask me that question, I think about some of the veterans that are going through therapy, and some of them are dealing with both physiotherapy and psychotherapy, and I would be surprised if there isn't a combination there. I'm not aware of a particular study or a program, but it would surprise me if that isn't the case.
Thank you for your excellent presentation, and really appreciated your historically rooted approach. I was wondering that I really also enjoyed how you described the origins of the term psychedelics, and I was wondering that now there are so many translations of how people kind of approach this, whether it's soul manifesting or mind altering. And of course, if you go to the origins of the term, what do you think Osmond and Huxley had in mind? How would they translate it? Sorry. Soul manifesting or mind altering. What did they have in mind when they came up with this term? What is your take on it? Thank you.
Yeah, if I want to be sort of literal in that interpretation, I think that with Osmond, he was very curious. In fact, as at the end of his life, when he was reflecting on his life and his sort of legacy to some extent through his daughter, who I was speaking with, he didn't even mention the word psychedelic or psychedelics as the thing he was most proud of. He was most proud of helping to co-found Schizophrenics Anonymous. This idea that patients and ex-patients had some capacity to form their own associations, be heard, and have peers who validated their own experiences. And now maybe it's because it was a time when you're not supposed to talk about psychedelics, he didn't want to talk about it. But I was struck by that. And I think that his psychomimetic idea, or this idea that you could understand, appreciate, even empathize with people suffering from something that seemed so hard to reach by traditional psychotherapy or psychiatrists or psychoanalysis, I think that was a piece of the psychedelic puzzle that he was really drawn to. So I think that was his thinking. Thank you.
Thank you.